No, it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk with you. I wish we could be talking about a subject that was much more uplifting, but in a way we are talking about a subject that's uplifting, just a setting that's a little bit of a downer. I'm very much not, if you take a look at my resume, the last thing I am qualified to be would be a social activist. I didn't study to be one. I studied actually to be a Russian historian. And then through an accident of taking the Russian language while I was playing football and drinking beer, it showed up on my resume. And when the United States and the former Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in December of 1987, suddenly the Department of Defense was tasked with implementation of this treaty, and the Marine Corps was tasked with providing Russian-speaking officers. Now, if anybody's ever gone to college and played football and drank beer and took Russian language, you'll understand that the drinking the beer sticks with you, playing football sticks with you until you get over 40, and then, but the Russian language certainly doesn't. It's a tough language. I mastered the ability of memorizing enough words to pass the test and forgetting everything. And unfortunately, the computer said otherwise. My name showed up on a list, and I ended up in the former Soviet Union as a weapons inspector. The last thing I really wanted to be, because I was trained to kill Russians, not hug them. And yet it turned into a Russian hugging experience, a great experience, in fact. It opened my eyes on a lot of things. But I was still a Marine, and when I finished that job, the first Gulf War was starting to cook up, and I engaged in that war as a Marine, as a combatant. And what I'm trying to get at is that's what I'm programmed to do. All right? My job as an adult for the most of my adult life was to wage war. And I consider myself to be an artist at it. I was pretty good at it from my perspective. I also am trained to do something else. I was an intelligence officer. And, that's a fancy word for spy. And something I'm very good at, or was very good at, was gathering data in denied areas. People didn't want me to know something, or want my government to know something. I was the kind of guy they tapped to find out where it is and what it was. From that resume, please help me derive the notion of peace activist. It's not there. But I'll tell you what, we're actually cut out of the same piece of cloth. You see, as an intelligence officer, my job wasn't to tell my boss what he or she wanted to hear. My job was to put the facts on the table and let them make a decision. That's their job. My job is simply to put the facts on the table. Let the truth speak. And as a peace activist, I would imagine that's what your job is as well. Is to seek the truth, is to seek what the facts are. Let's take a look at reality here and derive the proper conclusion. And when we speak of the proper conclusion when it comes to war, I'll tell you another thing that my 12-year experience in the Marine Corps taught me. There's no such thing as a good war. We can talk about war, and we can even talk about the necessity of war. We can have a debate, is there ever just cause for a war? But I'll tell you what, if you guys are walking down the street of Miami and somebody pulls out a gun and seeks to mug you, you're screaming for the cops. All right? You're saying, I need someone to protect me from an element that is deviating from the rule of law. All right? And so cops, we don't condone the cops prying where they don't belong. The cops themselves have to operate within the framework of the rule of law, but we recognize the need for an enforcer of the law. Therefore, if we speak of global society, we have to understand the need, the necessity for an element within global society to protect us from those who deviate from the rule of law. And in the case of global society in the post-1945 time period, the rule of law, that is that framework that connects nations together, is the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, we have that charter. It's there. And the charter is quite specific about conditions under which nations may go to war. And remember, the United States is a signatory to this charter. It's not as though a bunch of third world nations came up with this document and tried to shove it down our throat. I think it was actually drafted in San Francisco. I know from a Republican perspective, might not be the best pedigree in the world, but it's an American city, whether you like it or not, and it was drafted by Americans. So it's pretty much an American document. The world said, yeah, we accept this. 2 conditions under which nations can go to war. Article 51, self-defense. You attack me, I get to defend myself. And the beauty of Article 51, it isn't just that I get to defend myself, but you know, this club I joined, this organization called the United Nations, they're going to come and defend me as well. Because that's the way the system works. You attack me, I declare Article 51 violation, Security Council endorses it, and the world comes riding off to save me. Another one is Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Allows for a situation to be determined by the Security Council of the United Nations that if a situation occurs where international peace and security is deemed to be at risk, the Council can pass a resolution under Chapter 7 authorizing the use of military force to restore the condition to that which is acceptable to the world. Those are the 2 conditions. You know what's not in the Charter? Preemptive warfare. Preemptive warfare is not in there for a reason. For a reason. Well, you'll have a hard time finding an international lawyer who will be able to convict somebody for the crime of planning and implementing a preemptive war of aggression. There is precedent. It's called the 1946 Nuremberg Tribunal, where German generals and diplomats were put on trial, found guilty, and executed in some cases for the crime of planning and implementation of a preemptive war of aggression. Now, this wasn't some little junta of third world judges that carried out this justice. It's actually a former Supreme Court justice named Jackson, Judge Jackson, who made this finding. And Judge Jackson said that the planning and implementation of a preemptive war of aggression isn't just a war crime, it's the supreme war crime, because from this, all other war crimes occur. So I can sit there and say there are conditions under which you might say war is a tragic reality. I won't say necessity, I'll just say a reality of the human condition. But I will also say that there's nothing good about war. And one of the big problems we have as a society is that we've glamorized war. We've turned it into some existential form of entertainment. As long as somebody else is doing the fighting, it's pretty fun to watch, especially in this day and age of instant gratification, where we can get the grainy black and white image of a bomb coming in. We see little people moving around. You've seen the videos. Briefer up there. Ladies and gentlemen, here's an important strategic bridge. There goes a truck going across, there's another truck, and here comes the luckiest Iraqi alive. Ha ha ha, chuckle, chuckle, as a man on a bicycle goes across, and then the bomb takes the bridge apart, and the man keeps riding his bike, and he was lucky. He was innocent. He was about to die from a bomb we dropped. He had nothing to do with this situation. Ladies and gentlemen, war is about one thing and one thing only. Human beings killing human beings. Let's not try and glamorize it. Let's not try and turn it into something that's pretty. It's awful. And we should actually seek to avoid war at all costs, but it's an unfortunate reality. It's there. There are bad people out there that seek to do us harm, and we have every right to have a military. And this is one of the problems we collectively as the anti-war movement have today in America. The concept of how do we oppose a war that we find to be morally reprehensible. Let me say, all war is morally reprehensible. How do we find a war that's morally reprehensible but maybe might be a necessity, but we realize it's not a necessity. There's no reason for us to be in Iraq. Okay? They didn't attack us. And the world did not find that Iraq posed a threat that was deemed worthy of a military response under a Chapter 7 resolution. None of these conditions existed. What occurred in Iraq was the United States of America planning and implementing a preemptive war of aggression. That's what occurred. This was an elective war. We decided to go to war. It was not thrust upon us. So how do we say we're against this war without being accused of being against the troops? It's one of the biggest problems that haunts what I'll call the anti-war movement in America today. Because you say, hey, I'm against this war. People say, well, you're against the troops. The troops are the mission. The mission is the troops. You have to support the mission to support the troops. And if you don't, If you say this is a bad mission, then you're stabbing the troops in the back. That's the argument. And a lot of people say, well, gosh, you know, I don't want to stand up because the last thing I want to be accused of is not supporting the troops. You know, it's a big peer pressure thing. You know, so what they're saying is you got to support war if you support the troops. And that hamstrings the anti-war movement sometimes. What a silly, silly argument. I mean, let's think about it. What can we draw upon in our personal lives that will allow us to take this argument on head on? Because thank goodness the majority of us here are not combat veterans. I know we have a few in the room, but the majority of us haven't been to war. And you know what? That's a good thing. We don't want to go to war. But how do we take on this argument where people say, if you stand up against the war, you're stabbing the troops in the back? Let me think for a second. I'll tell you, let's fast forward tonight, 2:30 at night. I don't know what you guys do here in Miami at 2:30 at night. Back in New York, I'm asleep in my bed. Visions of sugar cubes or whatever dancing in my head. And all of a sudden, I smell something, smoke. I get up, I open my door, and the hallway's full of smoke. I say, oh my God, my house is on fire. I take a step out in the hallway because my kids are right across the hallway from me. And I got to get to my kids, but I can't. The heat drives me down. And I've taken a suck of air, of smoke, and I'm coughing. I have to go in and shut the door. I'm in a panic now because my house is on fire and my kids' lives are at risk. So what do? I go to the phone and I dial what? 911. Why? Because I want the fire department to come. Why do I want the fire department to come? Because my house is on fire. My kids are trapped. I want them to help me out. At that point in time, firefighters are the best thing in the world in my life. Now, we always make fun of them because they sort of hang out at a firehouse. We always pass by and they're eating. Or they're doing something. They're playing food, they're sleeping, they're eating. They're never doing what you think they're supposed to be doing until your house is on fire. And now you want them now. And when they come, do you want them coming in an old horse-drawn buggy? Get up, George. No, you want them in a brand new spanking engine that's going to work. And you want that engine to come to a fire hydrant that's near your house. And you want them, when they hook up to the fire hydrant, that the water's going to work. It comes out at the appropriate pressure. And when they pump up that engine, it's going to pump out the water to a hose. It's not going to burst, held by a firefighter in the appropriate gear, who's going to throw a ladder up, take the window, go in, grab your kids, put the fire out, and save your life, save the day. We love firefighters when our house is on fire. Do we not? Do we love fire? We hate fire. We hate fire as a society. Fire is destructive, and we recognize it as such. We do not give medals to arsonists. All right? There's a reason. Because arsonists set fire that destroys society. We despise fire. We hate it. But we love our firefighters. And we want our firefighters to have good equipment, good training, good leadership, so that when we dial 911, they come and put the fire out. That's what it's about, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have to love war to appreciate our military. If there comes a time and place when someone says, there is a threat to our way of life, someone is ready to attack us, someone has attacked us, we dial that national 911. We want our military to show up. Not in old, outdated tanks. We want the best tanks, the best equipment, the best training, the best leadership possible so that they engage and prevail against the enemy. But do we support war? No. We can hate war and despise war and be against war and still support the military, just like we hate fire, despise fire, are against fire, and support our firefighters. What do we do every October? What is October? National Fire Prevention Month. Firefighters go around. I say, I'm a firefighter in New York, so that's why I like this firefighter analogy thing. We go around to schools, and we tell all the kids about fire. What to do, how to change the battery in your smoke detector, etc. Fire prevention is a national way of life. We have fire codes for how we build our buildings. Believe it or not, our society is geared to be against fire. Why can't we be war preventionists? What's wrong with that? Can't we be war preventionists and still be against war? I mean, still be for the military? Just like we can practice fire prevention, but have a fire department that's well-trained, well-led, well-equipped. And that's the mindset we have to start adopting as a society. One of the things about the concept of anti-war is that it has a negative connotation put in there. Okay, that's fine, I'm anti-war, but it easily adapts itself to being anti-military. Why don't you just say, no, I'm a war preventionist? just like I'm a fire preventionist. I don't like fire. I'm against fire. I want to prevent fire, but I donate every year to the fire department because I think these firefighters are great. Need to eat less. Sorry, they're working out a little bit more, but that's all right. I'd rather have a fire department spend their entire life training to fight fire and never have to fight a fire, especially if the fire's in my house. I'd rather have a military training their whole career to fight a war that they never have to fight. That's a good use of our military, believe it or not. You don't have to use it. I'd rather have a situation where we never had to use our military, but I want one there. I want one there. So first of all, we have to reprogram ourselves to be war preventionists, and we have to address this from that standpoint. It's about the psychology of engaging the American people. And that's one of the problems we have. You know, I didn't want to be an anti-war activist. I don't consider myself to be an anti-war activist. I consider myself to be someone who is simply doing a job. And the job that I do is a job that's derived from an oath I took when I took my commission as a Marine Corps officer. It's an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's a curious concept. I didn't take an oath to obey the president no matter what. I didn't take an oath to jump off a cliff when Congress says jump. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign, and here's an important part of it that a lot of people overlook, and domestic. The Constitution. I was a defender of the Constitution. I am a defender of the Constitution. I may be a card-carrying member of the Republican Party, but I'm an American first and foremost. And the oath I took wasn't to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or any political affiliation. It was to my country as defined by the only document that defines my country. And that is the Constitution of the United States of America. It was curious, so I took that oath and I said, well, holy cow, what am I defending? I mean, I took a couple civics classes in high school when I wasn't playing football and trying to drink beer. And then I got to college where beer was available, and I didn't study the Constitution in depth either there. So I started pulling that Constitution out and reading it. Why? Because I just said I'm going to die for it. I'd like to know what I'm dying for. It's amazing how your eyes get open when you read the Constitution. You say, holy cow, that's what my country's really about. Wait a minute, I read the Constitution. Man, women didn't have the right to vote. Slaves were measured as 3/5 of a human person. This is a fundamentally flawed document, is it not? Then you get to the amendments, and you see that as a nation we grew. And as we grew, we improved ourselves. We passed amendments to fix problems in the Constitution. We're still trying to fix problems today. The Constitution is not perfect. It's not the Bible. It's not carved in stone, so to speak. If we the people, and that's an important phrase. You know where that phrase comes from? The preamble to the Constitution. We the people of the United States of America. That's what it starts out as. And that phrase has been found by the Supreme Court of the United States to give ownership of that document, the Constitution, not to the President, not to Congress, but to we the people. It's our document. We own it. Now, I don't want to put anybody on the spot here, but how many people here have actually read the Constitution? Okay, we're doing better. Now keep your hands up. How many of you right now, if 80% was the passing score, could think you could pass a test on the Constitution? Hands go down. Still, we got some people doing well. Maybe constitutional lawyers. I'm in Miami. I'm sure there's some of them here. Tell you what, go to an American high school as I do and speak to the graduating class as I do several times a year. And ask the students there, how many of them have read the Constitution? Less than 10% can raise their hands. Ask of those 10% how many are willing to take a test on the Constitution. And the hands drop down even further. Ladies and gentlemen, how can you defend that which you do not know? How can we speak about outrage, about violations of the Fourth Amendment? You know the Fourth Amendment, protection against illegal search and seizure. What do you think warrantless wiretapping is, ladies and gentlemen? When the government of the United States says we get to listen in on your conversations, monitor your emails, and do anything we want to do in the name of security. Is that not a violation of the Fourth Amendment? I'd like to believe it is. I've actually read the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution. I've gone into the Federalist Papers to try and get insight into what our founding fathers were thinking when they wrote the Constitution, the debates that occurred leading up to the passage of the Bill of Rights. And, you know, the problem is, in this post-9/11 society we live in today, people have bought into the notion that we can give up some of our liberty in the name of security. Benjamin Franklin, one of those founding fathers, said that those who are willing to give up liberty in the name of security deserve neither. And that's absolutely correct. But here we are, we're talking about defending something. The rule of law is set forth by a document which the majority of the American people are unfamiliar with. Now, this is a problem, you see, because when we take a look at where we're at, and I'm assuming the majority of the people in here, if I said, would you call yourself pro-war or anti-war? The majority of you put your hand up on the anti-war side. I'm not asking for a poll right now, but I'm thinking that the reason why you're here tonight is because you're inclined to say that maybe this war in Iraq, we shouldn't be involved in it. Maybe our troops should be coming home, et cetera, or some variation of that theme. But the anti-war movement isn't succeeding. It's not doing its job. I mean, think about it. Okay, we're the anti-war movement. We're the war preventionists. Have we prevented a war? No. We're in Iraq. We didn't win that one. Are we out of Iraq? No. We're in Iraq. We'll be there for a long time. Then we got this other thing brewing up on the horizon, Iran. You know, and are we stopping policies being implemented by our government that will slow down or impede a war with Iran? No. We sit back with this democratically controlled Congress and watch the Senate pass a resolution that labels the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Command as a terrorist organization at a time when we have two war powers resolutions in place that give the president carte blanche to launch military strikes against declared terrorist organizations. So the anti-war movement's not doing its job. It's not winning. And so what I did as somebody who traveled around the country speaking out against the war, I never called myself part of the anti-war movement. I was just an American citizen doing his job, defending the Constitution, speaking out in the name of truth. But I associated a lot with anti-war organizations around the country. They're full of really good people who are putting their hearts and souls into this problem. But as a problem, after about 2.5 years, 3 years of working with them, I said, you know, guys, we're not winning. We're losing. We're getting beat. This was a football game, it's fourth quarter, and it's 60-0, and we got the 0. What are we doing about it? I mean, you know what the definition of insanity is, don't you? You know, where you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting the outcome to change? Well, that's pretty much where I put the anti-war movement. It's insane, because you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and yet you expect the outcome to change. That somehow, if I have yet another vigil where we hold hands tightly, light candles, and sing Kumbaya yet again, that America will see the light and the troops will come home. No. At what point in time does the activities of the anti-war movement become nothing more than collective self-gratification and stop being a serious social movement to achieve meaningful change in how our society behaves when it comes to issues such as war and peace? And I was very frustrated by the anti-war movement's sort of self-delusion. We'll have another demonstration. We'll have another gathering, another vigil. And yet the war goes on and on. The death toll goes higher and higher. So I wrote an article called The Art of War for the Anti-War Movement. And basically I said, look, it's time that the anti-war movement understand the reality of their current predicament. You're at war. It's sort of frustrating if you're the anti-war movement to think you're at war. You're at war. What is war? War is conflict. You're engaged in a conflict right now. You may not know it, but you are engaged in a conflict. And it's a life and death struggle for the future of America. That doesn't mean that if we lose that, you know, we're going to be raising the flag of, I don't know, the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran or Iraq or something. The American flag comes down and we get occupied. What it means, though, is if we lose this struggle, we may have the American flag up there. We may have something we call the Congress and the President, but it won't be America. Because if we lose this struggle, it means the Constitution becomes irrelevant. That the Constitution no longer serves as the foundation upon which our nation not only was built, but is governed. If America deviates from the Constitution, we cease to function as America. We are in a life and death struggle as we speak for the future of America, and it hinges on how we collectively address the issue of war. of war. And right now, the anti-war movement's not doing that. Oh, you're doing it individually. You do it fine individually. Even in small groups you do it. But collectively, you falter, you fall apart. Understand this, in America today, the side that has the most numbers associated with it wins. Okay, we still have, it's about the vote. I know Florida's a bad place to bring this up. Especially West Palm Beach, Florida. But generally speaking, if you got more people on your side, you win. The anti-war movement doesn't have the numbers. It's not organized for victory, and this is what you need to understand. You have to organize for victory. We're talking about strategy. The art of war is derived from a book written by a Chinese warlord named Sun Tzu. All right? Read Sun Tzu. And if you don't want to read Sun Tzu, read Clausewitz, read Napoleon, read about warriors who have mastered the art of conflict. And I'm not trying to say the anti-war movement needs to learn how to fix a bayonet and shove it and twist it. I'm saying that you need to learn about concepts of strategy. Where do you want to go? What's your overarching objective? And then how about operational art? How do we get there? What are the four things we say need to be done to get to our strategic objective? And then the tactics that make this work. Linking strategy with tactics, not just in a singular event, but over a course of time called a campaign. Military professionals have been doing this for centuries and succeeding. And the war preventionists, the anti-war community, needs to start doing this themselves, or else they will find that they will lose and lose and lose. And what's the consequences of losing? The consequences of losing are stark. The end of America as we know it. Like I said, it doesn't mean the flag comes down and the communists are in charge. It means that we may call ourselves Americans, but we no longer function as Americans. So the challenge to you is how do we organize in this manner? And this is why I wrote the book, The Art of War for the Anti-War. It's a challenge to you to wage peace with all the intensity and ferocity that people wage war. Except I'm not talking about bringing about death and destruction. I'm talking about bringing about a change on how America interfaces with the rest of the world. Right now, that which defines who we are and what we are is basically a militaristic approach. Think about the ultimate statement of national hubris. 300 million people dictating to 6.8 billion people the terms of coexistence. Now you understand how America interfaces with the rest of the world. And the challenge to us is to walk away from that notion that we alone are right and figure out a multilateral approach to do it. And what is that? The rule of law, the Constitution, the United Nations Charter. And if you do that, you've identified your center of gravity, that's another military concept, around which you can build a campaign based upon strategy, operational art, tactics. And we might prevail so that next time we talk about the score, we can at least put up a victory. You know what a victory would be? Not going to war in Iran. So that's the challenge I put to you. Not just to talk about how to get out of Iraq, but how not to get into Iran. I'm getting the signal that my introductory comments have gone on long enough, so now we're going to open it up to the floor for questions. Anybody have any questions at all about the art of war for the anti-war movement? Yes, sir.
As a focal point, the attempt to indict Rumsfeld in France and bringing the UN in to bear on our own leadership. I understand that the government is passing laws that if any of us support that kind of activity, we can go to jail. What do you believe about that, and where's our freedom of speech going? How threatened do you feel, for example, when you talk with us about what we can and can't do?
Well, I mean, I've read the Constitution.
The question. I don't think I heard it.
All right, the question dealt with the issue of, for instance, France is trying to, I guess, indict Rumsfeld, and then you indicated there's laws being proposed that would make any American who supports that kind of action, that would be a crime. So the question is, how do I feel about this? Is this an infringement on our freedom of speech? And then a derivative is, do I feel threatened about speaking out? In short, I don't feel threatened about speaking out. I mean, the beauty of our Constitution and the fact that we still have a viable constitution is that we can sit here tonight and have this kind of conversation without fear of jackbooted thugs coming, kicking down the door and dragging me and anybody in this audience off. I don't know how much longer this confidence will exist. Again, if we continue to give up our security in the name of, or our freedoms in the name of security, we'll have a problem. I just don't see a law being passed that would limit our freedom of speech when it comes to expressing support for, say, the indictment of Donald Rumsfeld in France or elsewhere. There might be politicians who make this noise. Remember, even the great John McCain, and I say that with all the sarcasm I can muster, talked about, declaring MoveOn.org to somehow be a treasonous organization that should be kicked out. There's no seriousness to that statement. It was a stupid statement. I'm actually glad he made it because it shows the rest of America what kind of leader this would be and maybe reduces his viability. But the point is, we have to defend freedom of speech. I had a very interesting lunch with Dr. Prinsky, and we talked about the McCarthy period, McCarthyism. You don't have to go too far back in American history to find out there was a time when there wasn't freedom of speech, where you were held accountable and there were consequences to play that were paid. And we have to defend against a resumption of this. Terrorism may become the new red threat. And anybody who speaks out in defense of our freedoms may be deemed to be supporter of terrorism if those freedoms are seen as somehow giving a safe haven to terrorists. I would say that if you're for the indictment of Donald Rumsfeld, and I am, and they call that sedition, let sedition begin here tonight. Let's indict Donald Rumsfeld for his war crime. But rather than waiting for the international community to do it, I'm tired of Americans saying let's support the European. How about us doing it? How about the United States holding Donald Rumsfeld accountable for what he's done? How about holding Dick Cheney accountable for what he's doing? How about holding George W. Bush accountable? Let's not wait for a so-called international court to solve our problems for us. These are problems that are derived from the failure of the American people, and therefore it's up to the American people, I think, to fix these problems. Next. Yes, sir, in the back.
Speaking of the failures of the American people, a successful military campaign relies upon command, chain of command, and good organization. How do you get disparate groups of anti-war activists to coalesce around an idea and give up some of their autonomy to the larger cause?
A key element, and I mentioned this in the book, is the concept of identifying a center of gravity that all agree upon. And that's why I'm a big proponent of the Constitution of the United States of America. It seems to me that the pro-war element has accepted a form of logic that says that the Constitution, isn't a suicide pact. I don't know if you've ever heard that argument. It's not a suicide pact, and you can't expect us to die for this Constitution. Wow, there's whole graveyards full of Americans who've died for this Constitution. I mean, it is a suicide pact because without the Constitution, we don't have an America worth dying for. And so what I put forward to the anti-war movement, the war prevention movement, whatever you want to call it, is the notion of saying we're the pro-Constitution movement. We're pro-rule of law. We're defending America, and let's get people to agree on that. The other thing I say is that you got to drop all the peripheral stuff. All right, so when you have an anti-war demonstration, Free Mumia goes out the window, Save the Green Turtle goes out the window, and all this other stuff. I'm not saying these aren't viable causes, they are. But you got to focus, you got to keep it simple. The pro-war, if you look, just take a lesson from the Republican right wing. Okay, they have a debate. They're on national TV, and you got 30 seconds now. Each person gets 30 seconds. And they go, hey, what do you believe in? Guns, gods, and gays. These are the three issues we got to worry about. Guns, gods, and gays. Okay. You, liberal progressive, pulls out a little manifesto, 20 pages long. Well, the first thing is we got to talk about the guaranteed right of everybody to wear pink on Friday. You got to be able to wear pink on Friday, and you keep going. 30 seconds, and well, that's enough. Well, I just got started. I've got 20 more pages of things that no, you lost them. You got to simplify it. I'm not saying dumb it down, but the point is, you got to be able to grab the attention of the American public in a short, concise, effective manner. In finding a way to turn the Constitution into a bumper sticker would be, to me, the best approach possible. I don't know. I don't write these fancy bumper sticker slogans. But the point is, to me, there'd be nothing more capable, nothing more embraceable than the Constitution. Of course, you got to read it first, and that's the biggest challenge. That's why I put it in as an appendix of the book, Waging Peace, the Constitution there, so that anybody goes, well, I haven't read the Constitution. There it is. Appendix A. Feel free to read it. Yes, sir.
Given the September strike that the Israelis did on that Syrian nuclear plant, supposedly, and what you mentioned about the terrorism declaration, how do we get a sense of urgency about Iran? I mean, we all have friends who are in the military. I have a son who's done 2 tours. I don't want to see him go to Iran, especially when the operations tempo is so hot that there is no army out there. Yeah. I mean, there's people who probably won't appreciate that until you're close enough to it. But how do we get the sense of urgency? How do we get something going on Iran before we're there like we are in Iraq?
No, it's a good question. Where, you know, it's given the September strike, the Israeli strike against a alleged nuclear target in Syria, and given the Senate resolution calling the IRGC a terrorist organization, given all the rhetoric that's going on, how do we get momentum to stop a war, head off a war in Iran before it happens? You know, and the gentleman made a good point. You know, we don't have the military wherewithal to, I would say, sustain a fight with Iran. We can always initiate a fight. It's the sustainment that becomes the problem. It even gets worse than this. Right now, the planning, the thinking in Washington, D.C., at least from the perspective that others have made me aware of, isn't to invade and occupy Iran. They've actually simplified it now to a limited airstrike of 3 days to 7 days, depending on the targets and Iranian response. A limited airstrike, and that there's not going to be a need for military forces to go in. Well, that's curious. I mean, I'm not a 4-star general, but I've always been trained to understand a couple things about war. One, no plan survives initial contact with the enemy. So what we may call a limited strike in its initial phases, we're not in control because, part 2, the enemy has a vote. All right? And we don't get to change that vote. We don't get to recount it. They get the vote. And so if we start the game, they're going to respond, and we don't have any way of controlling their response. And then it just escalates out of control from there. You know, what happens if the Iranians decide that they are going to shut down the Straits of Hormuz? And now they do it. Now 40% of the world's oil supply is choked off. Well, we're going to have to put Marines in to execute War Plan or Op Plan 1076 or whatever it is nowadays to secure Bandar Abbas and the Straits of Hormuz. Where are these Marines going to come from? And then what happens if the war drags on? Now the Marines are there, but they can't move forward. So maybe the Army now has to execute its Op Plan to go into Azerbaijan and punch a core down the Caspian Sea coast, the outskirts of Tehran. Where are they going to get that core? We can generate that core. Right now our military is divided into a big pie, into thirds. 1/3 of our military is out there fighting the great global war on terror. 1/3's coming back from the great global war on terror, and the other third's getting ready to go over and fight. So we rotate like this. We can go into Iran, simply hold the pie in place, keep the third engaged, and bring the other third up. And now we've basically got enough troops to do it. Now sustain that, and that's the problem. How do you sustain that? And we can't. And this is where it gets frightening, because if the United States initiates conflict with Iran, and it doesn't stay limited in scope, it expands beyond our capacity to contain it with conventional military forces, and the consequences of our actions are such that we now have dire economic situations emerging. Oil is already $100 a barrel. If we go up against Iran, you're talking about oil hitting 200, 300, maybe even $400 a barrel. Now, I'm not an economist, but anybody ever heard the term hyperinflation? Because you have to understand, you may not know it. I mean, we just had Thanksgiving, but the price of food in America has gone up 15% in the last 6 months because of the price of oil. There's an effect. Now, we can absorb this through a slow inflation rate over a period of time, but if suddenly oil goes from 100 to $400 a barrel, prices go out of control. You ever seen that photograph of Weimar, Germany, with the person taking the wheelbarrow full of money to the market to buy a loaf of bread? You think the dollar's weak now? Wait. And now what happens if you have a president now who's under horrific political pressure because the war isn't going well? We don't have the conventional forces to resolve the issue. What do? Well, we just happen to have a president that's bought off on a new concept called usable nukes and has changed the American nuclear implementation policy to allow for preemptive use of nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear scenario. And this situation just goes over again. And now you have to ask yourself again, why are we attacking Iran? Because they're an imminent threat? They're not an imminent threat. Even the CIA itself says they're 5 to 10 years away from a nuclear bomb. And there's no evidence that they're producing a nuclear bomb, that they have a nuclear weapons program at all. That's all hyperbole, rhetoric, speculation, no fact. 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Miami is 10 years away from having a nuclear bomb. My hometown of Del Mar, New York is 10 years away from having a nuclear bomb. When the CIA says that somebody is 10 years away, it means they don't have any information whatsoever. They're making it up as they go along. There's no imminent threat from Iran worthy of the concept of military intervention. Therefore, why are we planning it? And the answer is it's about domestic American politics, the politics of empowerment. This is the pro-war element, that military-industrial complex that we've been warned about since the days of Dwight Eisenhower at play here. And that's what we've got to organize to fight and overcome. Yes, sir, you had your hand up.
Too bad you weren't real service, the Army. But nevertheless, sir, during the Vietnam War, the veterans led that anti-war movement. And you know, the veterans led thousands and thousands of marches, and you know, the films are still out there, and you know, half of us still love Jane Fonda, and you know, it's out there. And this time around, it's not growing the way it has, even though you know, the Iraq Veterans Against the War has been formed, the organization is growing. They're still not at the forefront, and they're nowhere near what the Vietnam Veterans Against the War were like. How does that organization consolidate? I mean, we've been putting them up in the forefront. How does that organization consolidate and get the support of the American people? They're not doing it. Yeah. These are veterans. These, you know, you know, we're still getting called, you know, commie lovers, Jane Fonda lovers, traitors. We're aiding and comforting the enemy and all that stuff. And people somehow or another don't get it.
No, I agree with the frustration, and it's good that the soldiers continue to come to the Marines for the answer. So just zing one back at you, buddy. But again, I was just a kid during the Vietnam War, so I don't know. I wasn't part of that movie. I've read about it, and we all know about book learning. It's like going to a fire academy and you come out with a great certificate and you show up at your first fire and someone says, now take that certificate and put the fire out. Well, you can't. You need to do it. Vietnam, I'll say a couple things. One, there are more soldiers in Vietnam than there are in deployed. So there was a larger. Two, more of them are coming home in body bags than come home. Thank goodness. I'm not saying that, but you know, the problem is America's not bleeding enough, and the only people that care right now in America are the families of the men and women who wear the uniform. There's not a conscript military today. The closest thing we have to a conscript military is the National Guard and the reserves, which have basically allowed this president to carry out a backdoor draft to keep this war going. But it's not as though the American youth have been asked to make a sacrifice, as America has been asked to make a sacrifice. So it's very difficult to talk about getting the kind of momentum domestically that's needed. We don't identify with this war. The other thing I'll say is that we don't have a media that's behaving in a manner which replicates the integrity that occurred in the 60s. We don't have a Walter Cronkite that's getting out there right now saying, you know, this war is lost, that we've done bad. We have a kiss-up media. I don't know how many people read the New York Times today, the Sunday Times. The two big stories. We won the war. It's over, man. It's there. The surge worked. We're 5,000 troops coming home. It's great. It's time to applaud. And the Democrats now, the New York Times has declared the Democratic Party to be impotent on this issue. They pretty much said that because the things are going so swimmingly in Iraq that the Democrats don't know what to say now. They're afraid to speak out in defense of the war. So it's a huge problem. The bottom line is, unless you get America to adopt the concept of that everybody who wears the uniform of the armed services are our sons, that we care about anybody wearing that uniform, A lot of people say we have to have a draft in order to get this. That in order to make America care, you got to threaten them with the draft. I don't want to go to war with a conscript military. The war is too complicated today. The weapons are too sophisticated. We need a professional military. But what we need, first and foremost, is an America to embrace its military. Our soldiers are volunteers, but they're not legionnaires. And they don't work for the president exclusively. They took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, and we should hold them to account to ensure that before we ask them to make a sacrifice, that it's in a cause worthy of the sacrifice. But so many Americans don't even understand where Iraq is and what the problem is. They don't know why we're fighting. Many Americans still believe that Saddam Hussein was linked to the events of 9/11. A lot of Americans believe there's still WMD to be found in Iraq. And now they're buying into the notion that Iran is somehow linked. It's about educating and informing the American public so they give a damn. The problem is it's going to come around. I think eventually the American public will wake up. But how big of a war memorial do we want? If you take a look at the Vietnam War Memorial, this is a war in Vietnam in 1966. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff knew we lost. Yet we continue to fight that war for 7 more years. Blink your eye and imagine 1972 being erased from the Vietnam War Memorial. Blink it again, 71's gone. See how it shrinks. Imagine we blinked it down to 1966, how small that war memorial would be. Right now, America needs to realize we've lost the war in Iraq. It's not worth fighting. Not one more American should die, but we can't get support for bringing this war to an end, and we're just going to keep losing Americans.
But the majority of the soldiers know that they're running convoys for Blackwater. The soldiers know this. The returning soldiers know this.
Excuse me.
Yeah, but how do you translate that into meaningful political change?
I'm asking you.
Okay. the bottom line again is I think it's and this is a statement I'll make. The day we, the American people, rely on our soldiers to do our job, because let's remember that the job we're talking about is our job. It's not the job of the soldiers to oppose bad policy. Soldiers implement policy, and if you read the Constitution, you understand that the military falls under civilian leadership for a reason, that we don't want a politicized military. Their job is to implement policies made by civilians. So instead of sitting there saying we need the soldiers to rise up against this conflict, they will over a course of time. It's a bad war, they will. But that's not the solution. The solution is for the American people to rise up against bad policy. And we can't wait for the soldiers to take the lead. In Vietnam, they took the lead. Today, they're not going to take the lead. We have to take the lead. And if we wait for the soldiers to take the lead, that war memorial is going to be a huge one that we're going to eventually build for the Iraq war. The duty and the responsibility and the onus is on the shoulders of we, the people of the United States of America. And frankly speaking, we've collectively failed, which is why I speak in this book about the need of the anti-war movement to organize. I've been told we have time for one more question, and you've been raising... I'll take 2 questions and then I'll answer. No? She's strict. 1 question.
I hope in this book, and I haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, but that you bring up impeachment, because that is the way to put a stop to all of this, and that is the way to stop the Trump going to Iran. And it can be done. It's on the table, and this will bring these people down.
What I bring up in the book is the rule of law is set forth by the Constitution. And I mentioned in the book that impeachment is a constitutional remedy. All right? But we don't live in the Old West. Impeachment cannot be a catchphrase for a lynch mob. And that's what we have to ensure doesn't occur here. We can't, because that's just not what... Impeachment is a process. And the first part of that process is a finding that laws have been violated. So impeachment actually comes later in the phrase. We don't start off saying, I'm going to impeach. We start off by saying, we're going to investigate. Whether what's happened here. I'd like to give you a good one to investigate. The lead up to the war in Iraq. I'd like to investigate statements made by our government officials about weapons of mass destruction and other things that were put forward. Certainly, I'd like to talk about Condoleezza Rice's statements to the Congress in October, November 2002, where she said, war isn't on the table. This president has not made a decision to go to war. But we now know the president signed the execute order on August 28th. I'd like to bring this up. I'd like to see Congress do its job of oversight of the executive branch. And through the process of holding a hearing, if data is derived which shows that high crimes and misdemeanors have occurred, that's language in the Constitution speaking about grounds for impeachment, then and only then do we say, now we have a basis for impeachment. Rather than saying we're going to put impeachment on the table, it's already on the table. The Constitution exists. But don't put it up front. That's where I say I'm not a big member of the impeach now group, because the impeach now sounds a little bit too much about let's drag him out of the jail and lynch him up by the tree till dead. I'm a big favor of Congress doing its job in accordance with the Constitution. And if Nancy Pelosi wants to sit here and say tonight that she will not authorize a hearing into the actions of the Bush administration in the lead up to a war that's cost nearly 4,000 Americans their lives, then she doesn't deserve a job.
Well, that's what she is saying.
That's why I know she is. But the point is, I think if we took it another...
It's simply an indictment, so we agree with you.
Fine, but...
The only way these people are going to tell the truth is when, if ever, is to have to raise their hand.
I agree.
Take an oath.
And let's make them do that. I'm in favor, but that's a hearing, not an impeachment. That's a hearing.
Thinks an impeachment is a lynch mob. It's a process.
No, you don't. You don't have to impeach. You have to have a hearing before you can get the impeachment. You have to have a finding that a crime, that there is reason to believe this has occurred or that it has occurred. High crime and misdemeanor now is grounds for impeachment. But we have to determine that a high crime and misdemeanor has occurred and there is an official process for that. That's what I'm in favor of. I think we're on the same sheet of music. We're just talking about semantics right now. But ultimately, the constitutional remedy for malfeasance on the part of the executive is impeachment. And I think we can agree that there's reason to believe that serious malfeasance has occurred at the highest level. And if America's going to stand for anything, if we're going to claim to be supporters of the Constitution and claim to be people who believe in the rule of law, nobody is above the law, not even the President of the United States of America. And if America is going to be America, not only today but in the future, we have to hold everybody accountable, including the President. Sure, under oath. Thank you very much. That's... There's nothing good about war. And one of the big problems we have as a society is that we've glamorized war. We've turned it into some existential form of entertainment. As long as somebody else is doing the fighting, it's pretty fun to watch, especially in this day and age of instant gratification where we can get the grainy black and white image of a bomb coming in. We see little people moving around. You've seen the videos. Briefer up there. Ladies and gentlemen, here's an important strategic bridge. There goes a truck going across, there's another truck, and here comes the luckiest Iraqi alive. Ha ha ha, chuckle chuckle, as a man on a bicycle goes across, and then the bomb takes the bridge apart, and the man keeps riding his bike, and he was lucky. He was innocent. He was about to die from a bomb we dropped. He had nothing to do with this situation. Ladies and gentlemen, war is about one thing and one thing only. Human beings killing human beings. Let's not try and glamorize it. Let's not try and turn it into something that's pretty. It's awful. And we should actually seek to avoid war at all costs, but it's an unfortunate reality. It's there. There are bad people out there that seek to do us harm, and we have every right to have a military. And this is one of the problems we collectively as an anti-war movement have today in America. The concept of how do we oppose a war that we find to be morally reprehensible. Well, let me say, all war is morally reprehensible. How do we find a war that's morally reprehensible but maybe might be a necessity, but we realize it's not a necessity. There's no reason for us to be in Iraq. Okay? They didn't attack us. And the world did not find that Iraq posed a threat that was deemed worthy of a military response under a Chapter 7 resolution. None of these conditions existed. What occurred in Iraq was the United States of America planning, engaged in that war as a Marine, as a combatant. And what I'm trying to get at is that's what I'm programmed to do. All right? My job as an adult for the most of my adult life was to wage war. And I considered myself to be an artist at it. I was pretty good at it from my perspective. I also am trained to do something else. I was an intelligence officer. And, that's a fancy word for spy. And something I'm very good at, or was very good at, was gathering data in denied areas. People didn't want me to know something, or want my government to know something. I was the kind of guy they tapped to find out where it is and what it was. From that resume, please help me derive the notion of peace activist. It's not there. But I'll tell you what. we're actually cut out of the same piece of cloth. You see, as an intelligence officer, my job wasn't to tell my boss what he or she wanted to hear. My job was to put the facts on the table and let them make a decision. That's their job. My job is simply to put the facts on the table. Let the truth speak. And as a peace activist, I would imagine that's what your job is as well. Is to seek the truth, is to seek what the facts are. Let's take a look at reality here and derive the proper conclusion. And then when we speak of the proper conclusion when it comes to war, I'll tell you another thing that my 12-year experience in the Marine Corps taught me. There's no such thing as a good war. We can talk about war, and we can even talk about the necessity of war. We can have a debate, is there ever just cause for a war? But I'll tell you what, if Article 51 violation, Security Council endorses it, and the world comes riding off to save me. Another one is Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Allows for a situation to be determined by the Security Council of the United Nations that if a situation occurs where international peace and security is deemed to be at risk, the Council can pass a resolution under Chapter 7 authorizing the use of military force to restore the condition to that which is acceptable to the world. Those are the two conditions. You know what's not in the Charter? Preemptive warfare. Preemptive warfare is not in there for a reason. For a reason. Well, you'll have a hard time finding an international lawyer who will be able to convict somebody for the crime of planning and implementing a preemptive war of aggression. There is precedent. It's called the 1946 Nuremberg Tribunal, where German generals and diplomats were put on trial, found guilty, and executed in some cases for the crime of planning and implementation of a preemptive war of aggression. Now, this wasn't some, little junta of third world judges that carried out this justice. It's actually a former Supreme Court justice named Jackson, Judge Jackson, who made this finding. And Judge Jackson said that the planning and implementation of a preemptive war of aggression isn't just a war crime, it's the supreme war crime, because from this, all other war crimes occur. So I can sit there and say there are conditions under which you might say war is a tragic reality. I won't say necessity, I'll just say a reality of the human condition. But I will also say that if you guys are walking down the street of Miami and somebody pulls out a gun and seeks to mug you, you're screaming for the cops. All right? You're saying, I need someone to protect me from an element that is deviating from the rule of law. All right? And so cops, we don't condone the cops prying where they don't belong. The cops themselves have to operate within the framework of the rule of law, but we recognize the need for an enforcer of the law. Therefore, if we speak of global society, we have to understand the need, the necessity for an element within global society to protect us from those who deviate from the rule of law. And in the case of global society in the post-1945 time period, the rule of law, that is that framework that connects nations together, is the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, we have that charter, it's there. And the charter is quite specific about conditions under which nations may go to war. And remember, the United States is a signatory to this charter. It's not as though a bunch of third world nations came up with this document and tried to shove it down our throat. I think it was actually drafted in San Francisco. I know from a Republican perspective, might not be the best pedigree in the world, but it's an American city, whether you like it or not. And it was drafted by Americans. So it's pretty much an American document. The world said, yeah, we accept this. Two conditions under which nations can go to war. Article 51, self-defense. You attack me, I get to defend myself. And the beauty of Article 51, it isn't just that I get to defend myself, but this club I joined, this organization called the United Nations, they're going to come and defend me as well. Because that's the way the system works. You attack me, I declare Article... No, it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk with you. I wish we could be talking about a subject that was much more uplifting. But in a way, we are talking about a subject that's uplifting, just a setting that's a little bit of a downer. I'm very much not, if you take a look at my resume, the last thing I am qualified to be would be a social activist. I didn't study to be one. I studied actually to be a Russian historian. And then through an accident of taking the Russian language while I was playing football and drinking beer, it showed up on my resume. And when the United States and the former Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in December of 1987, suddenly the Department of Defense was tasked with implementation of this treaty, and the Marine Corps was tasked with providing Russian-speaking officers. Now, if anybody's ever gone to college and played football and drank beer and took Russian language, you'll understand that the drinking the beer sticks with you, playing football sticks with you until you get over 40, and then, but the Russian language certainly doesn't. It's a tough language. I mastered the ability of memorizing enough words to pass the test and forgetting everything. And unfortunately, the computer said otherwise. My name showed up on a list, and I ended up in the former Soviet Union as a weapons inspector. The last thing I really wanted to be, because I was trained to kill Russians, not hug them. And yet it turned into a Russian hugging experience, a great experience, in fact. It opened my eyes on a lot of things. But I was still a Marine, and when I finished that job, the first Gulf War was starting to cook up, and I